All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started today. I'm Tracy Gonyu, Community Food Systems Developer for the Oregon Food Bank. And one of our goals for our statewide network team is to support food systems advocates across the state of Oregon through the Feast Leadership Network. And one of the ways we do that to support our Feast communities is through these quarterly webinars on topics you said you'd like to learn more about. Today we'll be focusing on grants for starting small and mid-size organizations. We hope this will help your groups find appropriate funding for your project initiatives. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Please keep yourself muted to minimize background noise. So you should see, I think that you'll have kind of a GoToMeeting console on the right side of your screen by your name. There'll be a little microphone. Please just click that to mute yourself. Also, if you have any questions at any time, you can chat them into the chat box, so that'll also be on the GoToMeeting console. Please chat them in when you have the question. If it's appropriate, I'll direct it to our speakers at that moment. Otherwise, we will reserve those for the Q&A section at the end. And this webinar will be recorded and made available on our website probably by the end of the week. So looking at our agenda, we'll start today by talking about what grants are and aren't. From there, we'll go over what the different types or organizations are and how they can fundraise. Then we'll talk about grant readiness, where to find grants, and how to write a strong proposal. And we'll end with a list of resources and have time for question and answer. Our panelists this morning are steeped in the granting world, and it's a pleasure to introduce them both. Darcy Spar with the Oregon Food Bank began her nonprofit career as an AmeriCorps member and has since worked and volunteered for nonprofits of various sizes doing grant writing and management, marketing, communications, e-philanthropy, event planning, database and volunteer management, and many other fundraising activities. Darcy has more than 15 years of experience with grants, her favorite area of development. At Oregon Food Bank, she manages the grants team and provides fundraising consultation and training to regional food banks and partner agencies of the Oregon Food Bank Network. In her spare time, she volunteers for 2 GPA organizations, serving as the program's chair for the local chapter of the Grant Professionals Association and writing grants for Greyhound Pet Adoption Northwest. Alexis Millett with Nonprofit Association of Oregon has been providing training, consultation, coaching, facilitation, and program management to organizations throughout Oregon since joining NAO in 2011. Alexis designs and delivers high-quality interactive trainings that engages participants in current organizational development challenges. She has experience working with nonprofit leadership, staff, boards, and volunteers. In addition, Alexis brings over 10 years of experience facilitating difficult dialogue and delivering trainings on race, cultural competency, and privilege. Alexis brings an equity and inclusion lens to all her organizational development work. She believes that diversity, equity, and inclusion work must be integrated into the fabric of an organization to transform how board, staff, and volunteers work to create inclusive work environments and high-impact program strategies. Alexis is also knowledgeable in nonprofit compliance and best practices and has managed NAO's nonprofit helpline for 4 years. Thank you both so much for being here. I'm going to pass the mic to them and we're going to get started.
Okay, this is Darcy. I'm excited to be here with you today and talk about grants. As Tracy mentioned, it's my favorite area of fundraising, so I could talk forever. But we're going to start off with what grants are and what grants aren't. So start off with what they are. They're a great way to launch a new project or to expand an existing program. Most grant funders seem to want to fund the new, exciting, sexy project that you're doing. And even though we are, as grant professionals, have been advocating for kind of just, we need ongoing funding for those successful projects and programs that we have. And grant funders are kind of slowly paying attention to us, but it's still, grants are by and large really focused on what's kind of new or expanding or exciting. They're also a great way to leverage other forms of support. So maybe individual donors or corporate donors. If you receive a grant, that gives you your program and project some legitimacy and hopefully helps those other donors want to jump on the bandwagon and also support you. They're also an important part of your organization's overall fundraising plan. And the key word there in that bullet is part. And you will see in the next slide that grants are And so this is a presentation of overall charitable giving in the United States. Giving USA does this every year. I think the 2016 numbers are just about to come out. We're waiting with bated breath, but pretty much they stay the same, pretty similar every year. And what this shows you is that foundations are 16% of that giving. And now foundations are not exactly translatable into grants, because we have companies that give grants, and then there's some family foundations that may be more categorized as individuals, but it's a pretty good ballpark figure. And you can see that there's a lot of charitable giving from especially individuals. So as you're thinking about where to spend your fundraising time and how to fund your project or program or organization, you need to kind of keep that in mind. And obviously I love grants and I could talk about them forever, and today we're going to focus on grants, but I've also spent more than 20 years in nonprofit fundraising, and that's been an important thing that I've learned and that I want to make sure you know about this ratio when you're figuring out how to spend your time with grants and other forms of fundraising. So what are grants not? They are not a quick solution to a budget shortfall. Most grants have to go through a review process, and sometimes that can take many months. It's also, and that's even after you actually submit the proposal. Sometimes it can take a while to gather all that information and submit the proposal. They are not usually easy or low maintenance. Applying for grants is hard work. There's a lot that goes into it. To do it well, you want to take the time to research funders, if you can, to cultivate relationships with those funders, and then to put together an application or proposal that's really tailored to the priorities of that specific funder. In terms of not being low maintenance, a lot of them usually come with strings attached. So as I mentioned, that there are those ones that are kind of those unrestricted general operating grants, but those are still not really the norm. And so when you receive a grant, you most likely will have to track that, the financial aspect of it, and the report on program outcomes. Also, grants are not going to be successful usually without support from many different parts of your organization. Okay, so you know what grants are and aren't, and we're going to turn it over to Alexis to help answer the question, can my organization even apply for grants?
Great. And I really appreciate what you highlighted about being strategic in thinking about how do we look at all the funding opportunities. I think a lot of organizations don't realize how much individual fundraising is important, as well as looking at sort of earned income strategies as well on the other side of the coin. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking specifically about fundraising. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the different structures that exist and what that means for fundraising. And so when I say fundraising, I'm talking about fundraising with individuals or with foundations. So thinking a little bit about grants and what that means for your structure. So there are several types of nonprofits in the state, and there's two different ways to think about nonprofits. So there's the state level and what you are categorized under the state and what you can do, and then there's the federal level, the IRS. And so in the state of Oregon, there are three different types of nonprofits. There are public benefit nonprofits, and those are the ones that when people think of a nonprofit, that's what they think of. They're 501c3s or C4s. They're organizations that are organized to benefit a broader public mission. There's then mutual benefit organizations. Those are organizations that are organized to benefit a set of members that are part of their organization. And then there are religious organizations. And religious organizations do qualify for 501c3, and mostly because of separation of church and state, they have their own category. If you are not in Oregon, your state will have something similar, but it does look different state to state. And then the federal level is when you actually go for your 501c3 or another C tax exemption. One thing to note, there are over 20 other tax exemptions with the IRS, and 501c3, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, is the one that donations to them are tax deductible to the donor. And so when you think about becoming a nonprofit, you have to think about both the state and the federal level.
So who can fundraise? One myth that I hear quite often in the nonprofit sector is that you can't fundraise if you're not a 501c3, which is not true, but that what comes up is ethics around how you represent yourself. So only donations made to 501c3 organizations can be considered tax deductible to the donor. And it's really important that if you are not a 501c3, you haven't gotten that designation from the IRS at the federal level, that you don't represent yourself as a 501c3 to your donors. But you can still fundraise. Anybody can fundraise. It's just about representing yourself accurately. So there are three different structures that I'm going to talk about for fundraising. It's becoming a 501c3, a structure called fiscal sponsorship, and I'm going to just note about unincorporated associations as well. So if you want to become a 501c3 organization, these are the very overarching 6 steps that you need to consider. You need to first think about what your mission is and if it really is for a public benefit, and form your board, file with the state of Oregon, get your identification number with the IRS so that you can open a bank account, and then you will apply via Form 1023 or 1023-EZ to get recognized by the IRS. You need to follow fundraising laws, guidelines, and ethics. And the main perk of being a 501c3, besides the tax-deductible donations, is that you have protection by the state. So there's limited liability, and that's a huge reason why a lot of folks decide to go down that route in particular. Another great option is fiscal sponsorship. This is an excellent option for small emerging nonprofits who aren't quite sure if they want to go through the work of becoming a 501c3 and maintaining a 501c3, but they have a charitable project that they're really interested in and that they think will benefit their community. And essentially what you do is you partner up with an existing 501c3 where your project supports the mission of that existing 501c3. And they take you on as a project of their organization. The amount of autonomy given to the project varies depending on the agreement. So it's really important to have clear lines of communication with your fiscal sponsor. Make sure you have clarity on autonomy, because essentially your project is part of that organization. And so it's their responsibility to report on behalf of the organization. The money flows through the host organization or the sponsor, and donations are tax deductible. And it's pretty typical for those sponsors to take an administrative fee off the top of any funds that come to the project. And then you can also choose to remain unincorporated. And a lot of small organizations stay unincorporated. It is appropriate for really small informal groups in particular. Donations are not tax deductible, and you may be liable for taxes if you are raising money and bringing money in. It's something to be aware of. You need to be clear with your donors, and you could be held liable in a different way than if you're incorporated. So those are all things to make sure you're thinking about if you'd like to stay unincorporated. And so many unincorporated groups that want to start fundraising will start to look down the path of entering into a fiscal sponsorship agreement or becoming their own 501c3. So these are some great resources if any of these structures feel appropriate to you. The Oregon Nonprofit Corporation Handbook is sort of what I think of as the nonprofit Bible. It's an excellent, excellent resource. It walks you through the whole process of becoming a 501c3 and what the laws are pertaining to it. It was written by an attorney, but it's not legal speak. So it's a really great resource for folks who want that support. And the Principles for Good Governance and Ethical Practice have a whole section on fundraising and ethical fundraising, and those are both available on our website. We also have a helpline, so if folks have additional questions after this webinar, feel free to get in touch.
Okay, so now that you know a little bit about how you might form your nonprofit and get ready to start applying for grants, what are the things that you can do to really make sure that you have a grant-ready organization and program, and that you are in a good position to identify what funding opportunities are out there that will fit, and you can respond to them in a timely manner with a very competitive proposal? So first of all, we're going to talk about how to make sure that your organization is grant ready. And the first part is something that I have already talked about, really having grants as part of a diverse fundraising plan so that you have different kinds of funders and hopefully not relying on one major grant. That you have systems and processes in place to manage those grant funds if you hopefully do get some. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but things like having a bookkeeping system that can accurately track the grant funds separately from other funds that you receive. And this doesn't necessarily have to be complicated. This is not supposed to be scary. You can use things like QuickBooks or have put systems and processes in place through Outlook or Excel. But the important thing is to make sure you're figuring this out and you have those processes in place ahead of time. And then also that you have community support, especially financial support from your board or the leadership volunteers or whoever it is that's really leading this group. That also, besides support from the community and your leadership, that you have support from throughout your organization. And it may be that your organization has just a few people that do all of these things, but that you think about making sure that you have support and information from finance, from the program, from fundraising, and again, from your leadership in your board. So talking a little bit more about those systems for tracking and organizing, what is it that you want to make sure you are able to track and organize? Well, things like grant deadlines, information that you gather about those grant funders and any interactions that you have with those funders. And this can be really sophisticated. At Oregon Food Bank, we use Razor's Edge as our donor database, and we put a lot of that information in there. If you aren't familiar with Razor's Edge, it's kind of the Cadillac of donor databases, and you definitely don't have to feel like you have to go and have Razor's Edge to be able to have good tracking and organizing systems. You can have something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. And honestly, at Oregon Food Bank, our grants team, we still use an Excel spreadsheet for our grants calendar. So, and I've talked to lots of other grant folks who may have multiple systems in place. They may be using their donor database, but usually somewhere along the lines, there's an Excel spreadsheet somewhere that they use. So you too can use an Excel spreadsheet. Having a place to those proposals and reports, whether that's the electronic version that you submit, if you actually have to submit a paper form, or if you receive a grant, a letter that informs you that you got the grant, or a grant agreement. How are you going to organize those and keep those in some kind of system so you can refer back to them, or other folks in your organization can easily access those? Also, one of the things that I have often put into place where I've worked with grants is some kind of way to track what the grant requirements are in terms of reporting requirements, or what did we actually say we were going to do after we got the grant, and so that everybody who is involved with that grant is on the same page. At Oregon Food Bank, we call it the art form, which is confusing because we have nothing really to do with artistic stuff, but it's the additional restriction tracking form. At the last place I worked, we had a little bit clear. We just called it the new grant information form. So having something like that is also helpful. And then I made a note about passwords. Over the time I've been in grants, more and more grant proposals are submitted online, and you have to create an account and you have to have a password. And many times there might be multiple folks who are going to go in and work on that proposal. I know in my work with Greyhound Pet Adoption, we're all volunteers, and so I work on part of the grant, and we have the chair of our fundraising committee who's on the board and knows much more about what's going on, and it's easier for her to get information. She also works on the grant, so we have to make sure that both of us can get into the online portal to work on the grant. So making sure you have that recorded somewhere where everybody has access to that. Just to give you a sense, our team at Oregon Food Bank, about up to two-thirds of the grants that we submit are submitted online. So that's becoming a bigger and bigger part. And one note about online applications is making sure, especially for like government grants, that you go in way ahead of time and make sure you have the account set up, so you aren't facing the deadline with trying to figure out those technical or waiting to get approved to have your account. So another aspect of being a grant-ready organization is having access quickly to kind of general documents and information that grant funders will ask you to look at. And that could be your financial statements if you are large enough to have an official audit, what's your organization's annual budget, your 501c3 letter, or I really should have put here your IRS determination letter, because you may not be a 501c3. Your 990, that's not as common anymore that I've seen from funders requesting that, but if you do file a 990, that is often a good one to have on hand. List of your board members and qualifications of key personnel, like maybe a bio of your executive director or whoever the person is who is going to be implementing the project or the program. And then if you are applying with another organization as a fiscal sponsor, you may need these documents from that fiscal sponsor organization. And then boilerplate information, what I call the information that's frequently asked for in grants about your organization, and then you can modify it or take pieces of it based on the specific questions that the funder is asking. So a kind of a general description of your organization and your programs. Documentation of the need for the services that your organization provides, and who is it that you're serving, what's the kind of demographics and description of the population that you're impacting, and maybe a success story. How is it that you've impacted that population, or what has been the impact that you've had on your community? And what's the history? How did your organization get started? If there's specific qualifications that you can point to or accomplishments. What partners or collaborative relationships that are really important to your organization. For example, if you are maybe a partner agency within the Oregon Food Bank Network and can have some language about what that means. Or if you are applying with a fiscal sponsor, have a description of kind of the relationship between the two organizations and maybe how that evolved. And then basic things like the number of employees and volunteers that you have. Okay, switching over to a grant-ready program. So if you are applying for grant funding for a specific project or program within your organization, what is it that you need to be grant-ready? Well, your sustainability plan. And this is often the hardest question for me as a grants professional to answer. And I hate answering it oftentimes, and I just want to say, well, of course, we're going to keep applying for grants, but that's not usually the best answer. And it really usually is a good thing for your organization to consider and make sure that you've thought about it, because if grant funds are for those new and exciting and expansion projects, what's going to happen after the grant period is over? Is your organization going to be able to sustain that project or that program? And what's your plan for that? And then having a detailed plan for implementing the program or the project once you receive the funds, making sure that you know what the action steps are and who's responsible for each of those steps. And making sure that that program is really aligned with your mission and your strategic plan or your organizational priorities. So other things to make sure your program is grant ready, that you're able to describe the need for the program or the project or the services that you want to provide, and that it's backed up by your own experience or also data. And I always advise the more local you can make the data, the better it is. For example, if you can refer to like your county's community food assessment, then that's probably better than using numbers that apply all across the state of Oregon. An explanation of why your organization is the best one to carry out this program or project at this particular point in time, which means you probably have to know kind of the landscape out there, who else is doing similar programs, and how is your organization different from those organizations, or how do you fit in with that whole landscape? For example, maybe your organization is one of a number in your community that provides food assistance, but you or your organization has a specific expertise in helping the homeless population. And then measurable metrics. So know how is it that you're going to determine the success of the program. And this is just as much for your organization as it is for the funder, to know what is it going to mean that you are successful and that success is realistic. So especially if you're going to have to report on the program and the success of it after maybe the grant period of a year, probably ending hunger is not going to be the metric that you're going to use. But how is it that you are in this short period of time going to determine that the program or the project is successful? And what are those metrics that you're going to track, and how are you going to track them? Making sure that you actually can track those things and it really will fit within the folks who are implementing the program, and not so, because what you don't want is to be spending all your time trying to track these metrics and not as much of your time actually implementing the program and getting the services to those who need it.
And Darcy, can I make a note about that? Yeah. So I appreciate you talking about sort of data and outcomes and thinking about how you're going to measure success from the get-go. And that can be really challenging for very small organizations, but I think really pushing yourself to also think beyond numbers, right? So not just number of people served or number of programs that you ran or the amount of food that you were able to give out, but thinking about how you're transforming people's lives. Think about how it impacts them in the long haul as well, and thinking about how you might start to measure that. So once again, those are sometimes very tricky things to measure, but if you can start to think about that from the get-go and work that into the grant, it's very compelling to foundations.
Yeah, as I've been involved in grants, I've seen the transition of funders really looking mostly at outputs, which are like the number of classes or the number of food boxes, to outcomes and really of how you are impacting and changing people's lives. And that might be a little more like you have to actually do surveys or talk to your clients to figure that out. But funders are really starting to be more and more interested in those outcomes. So talking about budgets, the other most fun area that folks ask lots of questions about with grants. So having your budget for your program broken out into specific line items, and that's things like salaries, benefits, supplies, printing, occupancy, equipment, conferences and meetings, training, travel, and food are just all are common ones that I often see. And that will help you if you can break them down into those line items, that will help you make sure that you really have all of your costs covered. I think this is something that is one of my soapboxes, making sure that when we do budgets that we really cover all of the costs that it is going to take our organization to implement this program or project. For example, if you're looking at salaries or personnel overall, it's probably not just the program manager or the person or people implementing the program, but your executive director might have to spend some time overseeing the program or building community partnerships that are going to impact the program. And so really thinking about adding that into the budget. Maybe it's 10% of that person's salary and benefits that show up in that salary line item. That oftentimes it's really important to make sure you're thinking about the kind of indirect cost or administrative expenses. Is that it's adding this program or project, or does this program or project impact how much work your bookkeeper has, or if you're lucky enough to have an IT person, or if maybe you have to bring in an IT consultant if you have IT issues, that if you implement this new project or program, or even if you have it already existing, that really does impact the cost that you have to pay for those kinds of administrative things. So there's different ways to handle that. One organization that I worked for, what they would do is take all of those line items that I mentioned, kind of those direct expenses, and do a subtotal, and then based on what those administrative type expenses had been in the past, take a specific percentage that they added to all grant budgets. So we used, for example, 13.5%. Other things to make sure of are that you double check your calculations. You'll most likely be doing this in Excel, and I have learned this the hard way to kind of do some double checking because Excel is great at doing calculations for you, but only if you tell it the right thing. So for when I'll share one of my lessons learned, I had been using an organization budget and sending it out to grant funders for several months, and all of a sudden I noticed that the total of expenses of my organization, there was like 5 line items, and Excel was only adding up 4 because I hadn't put the formula in right. And so the total had been wrong for months that I'd been sending out to grant funders. Another lessons learned was making sure I recorded the formulas or the way that I made those, any kind of calculations. For example, thinking about if you are adding in a percentage of things, like let's say you decide your rent is $1,000 a month, and you have 3 staff in your organization, and one of those staff is really the one that is going to be implementing this project. So you think it's fair to include 1/3 of the rent in your project budget. Well, make sure that you note that that was how you came up with that end result of 1/3 of $1,000, because maybe when you go back a few months later when you've actually gotten the grant, or a year later when you have to report on it and you don't know how you came to that calculation, it's not easy to do your reporting or make sure you're spending it in the right way. One other thing I wanted to note is, what if your organization is made up of all volunteers and you don't have any salaries to list there, or you don't have hard costs? You can still enter in-kind expenses in a budget. I think it's Independent Sector that has that publishes a value of volunteer time, or you may have specific people doing specific jobs that it would have cost you a specific amount that you can include, and just make sure that it's very clear to the funder that this is an in-kind expense, that your organization is contributing and these volunteers are contributing their time. And also, maybe if your volunteers are the ones carrying out, that it's really important that you include money for their mileage or for their training. Okay, so you have done everything that I've advised. You're a grant-ready organization and you have a grant-ready program. Well, how do you find grants? So starting off, there's different types of grant funders. Those are the main ones there. Foundation grants, as we saw when we looked at the Giving USA report, foundations and grants are oftentimes used interchangeably. They aren't really, but foundations pretty much are the most common type of body that will give grants. There also are corporate grants. Some companies actually have separate foundations that give grants, and some give more just through their company. It may be marketing dollars that they're using. And then different types of government grants. And government grants vary widely in their application requirements and how complex they are. I would say in general, federal grants are usually the most difficult. They also have very large amounts. And it corresponds with the amount of time it takes to apply and to implement and track everything. And then there also are state and local opportunities, and those can vary widely too in terms of how much energy and effort they take to apply for and or implement and track. Oregon Food Bank gets a lot of funds through the Portland Children's Levy, a City of Portland government opportunity, and that has some significant requirements in terms of tracking and reporting on that. And your local city may have grants that aren't quite as complicated and complex to apply for. Another example of that Oregon Food Bank, we get money through DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality. So different types of grants, as I mentioned, you can get grants for just general operating support, your ongoing projects or programs that you do. It's becoming more and more common, but maybe not quite as common as us grant professionals would like. Most of the grants, I think, are still easier to get for specific projects or programs. And then there also are funders who want to fund capital, and that oftentimes means building, but sometimes it just means more tangible items like equipment. And then to distinguish a little bit between the letter of inquiry versus a full proposal, some funders will have more of a two-step process where they'll ask you to submit first a letter of inquiry or a letter of intent, and then they will kind of whittle down the pool from there. And some folks who submit LOIs, as we abbreviate it, are invited to submit a full proposal. So where to find those grant opportunities? And later in the presentation, I have links to a bunch of these, and you will have access to that, so you don't have to necessarily write all these down, and you'll be able to just click on the links and get them. But just to mention a few, Foundation Center is a great one. They have both paid and free services. Lots of funders, especially because you have to apply to many of them online, will have websites that tell you a lot about their organization, their requirements, their history. Grants.gov is a great one for federal grants. The Foundation Data Book is actually a book, a physical hard copy. I often refer to it as my Bible. And Oregon, there are different versions for Oregon and Washington, and I think the same publisher does another state as well. I can't remember, but the link will be there. And that's a listing of the different funders with who they've given grants to. Obviously, it's a little bit outdated by the time that you get it, but it's definitely helpful, and they have different ways to categorize them, so you can look through their indexes. Workshops and conferences are also a great place to meet funders and hear about new opportunities. Nonprofit Association of Oregon has put on a number of workshops or conferences that I've been to. I went to one just recently about funders who are funding in the area of equity, and learned about some funders who want to fund that. So be on the lookout for that. There's lots of oftentimes we'll refer to as the Meet the Funders, different types. And funders specifically will some funders will have their own where they will go out into the community and hold information sessions. Meyer Memorial Trust did that when they had a few months ago when they had their big annual opportunity. And I know that they've done times where they've traveled around the state to talk about their grant programs. I think Spirit Mountain Community Fund is another one that is really good about having workshops to tell folks about grants, and you can go in person and hear from them. And then other organizations what grant funders are funding other organizations, especially ones that do similar work to yours. Anything yet? Okay. So you've looked at the Foundation Center, you've read through the Foundation Data Book, or you've gone to a funder event, and you learned about a number of grant opportunities that might be right for your project. So how do you decide where to spend your time? Obviously, we all have limited time. Even here at Oregon Food Bank, we have 3 of us. That translates into about 2 FTE that work on grants. And that may seem like a ton of time to the smaller organizations, but we have many opportunities that we do not apply for. So what to consider as you're trying to figure out if you should pursue a specific grant opportunity, or if you have multiple ones, which opportunities should you look at first and prioritize? One of the most important things to think about is that mission fit. Does the mission and the priorities of the funder align with your mission and your goals of your organization and your project? What is the relationship that the funder has to your organization? Is there one already existing? Have they given to you in the past? Or are there relationships in terms of folks in your organization, board members or staff that have a relationship that know anyone that's involved with the funder? How much are they going to give you? What's the range of grant that you can potentially get from this funder? Their geographic focus. Are they a local funder, or do they fund organizations across the whole country? National funders they have obviously so many different organizations applying to them, it's going to be much harder to get funding from them. Obviously, unless maybe you go back up to the relationship to your organization. Maybe you have a close relationship with that national funder, and so then that helps you determine that maybe it's a little more likely. But just in general, local funders might be easier to get in with. The ease of the application. So how much time is it going to take you to put together this proposal? Is it 2 pages? Is it 15 pages? How many questions are you going to have to answer? Does it require a lot of attachments or information that you're going to have to gather from a lot of other people? Do you already have that boilerplate information that I referred to that's already written and you can just tweak it for the specific questions, or do you have to develop that? And note that the size of the grant, the amount that you might be able to get or that you're applying for, does not always correspond with how complicated the grant is. So you might think that writing a $2,000 grant is going to be much easier than a $20,000 grant, and that's going to be much easier than a $100,000 grant request. And that oftentimes is the case, but not always. It depends on the funder and their requirements, and also on how grant ready your organization or your project or program is. Other things to consider is, if you get this grant, will that help you generate additional funding? And then, is this a grant for a new program, or is it an existing program that they'll help fund? So maybe you have to prioritize, and your priority might be that you really need to get funding for the stuff that you're already doing, and it's kind of secondary to ask for a grant for something new that you will have to implement.
So one question that came in that seems appropriate to something you just noted here, Darcy, is do you have any more advice for using grants you have received to leverage other fundraising from individuals in your network?
From individuals.
That's what it says here. And Austin, feel free to type into the chat box if you have more clarification, but I'll pass this to you.
So definitely, I think it's really easy to use that for other grant funders, because you can reflect that in your budget. But and I don't do as much individual fundraising, but you can definitely, when you're talking to individual donors, you can mention that you got a grant from this particular organization. Maybe you, one-on-one. Also, if you are sending something out, whether that's an article in your newsletter or whether that's something on social media, maybe that you're posting, mention that grant funder. And of course, grant funders have different requirements around recognition and whether they want to be recognized, but if they have no problem, it's great to be able to mention that in multiple areas of your communications that you received this grant, and knowing that will provide some legitimacy for your work with individual donors. Does that help to that? So other things to consider are what are your internal resources? So what staffing do you have for grant writing? And that's who's going to write and manage the grant, who's going to implement the program, who's going to help develop the budget and or do the financial tracking and or reporting. And if it's you that's going to do all three of those, how much time are you going to be able to spend on that? And so you have to be definitely, if you have the less time that you have, the more selective you need to be about what funding and grants you pursue.
Darcy, can I ask a question about that? What are your thoughts on at what point an organization should actually hire someone externally to do their grant writing versus doing it internally, and sort of weighing the time benefit piece?
That is a really good question. I would say that I think it differs from every organization, but some things to consider are like, do you have any grants expertise or experience? And there's a lot that you can do to just kind of get started. Maybe apply for a couple things if they don't seem that complicated, or you can do that and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe when you're kind of ready to take the next step, if it's more than just the first couple grants, you might want to just check in. There's a whole range, I think, of ways that you can bring in a consultant to work on grants. And it may be that the most helpful thing, I know some of my grants colleagues who are consultants, their organizations may bring them in and say, we want you to write this grant. And once the grant professional goes in, what they really need is someone to help them kind of do that organizational assessment and do the grant readiness stuff, and not as much the writing piece of it and the submitting piece of it. That's something that maybe internally the organization can do, but they need kind of help coming up with their grants plan or making sure that they put together all of this boilerplate information and this and the documents required. So. But it sometimes is helpful to like try to get started internally, so you know what and if you do that very first grant with your internal organization resources, and it just takes so much out of you and so much time that you're ending up not being able to implement your programs or do other things, then that will help you decide, okay, this is not really the way we want to be spending our time.
Thank you.
Yeah. Program materials and space. So if you get this grant, is this like a new program that you're going to have to go out and get materials and find the space? Then that might help you determine how much energy and effort you want to spend on this. Do you already have your community partnerships formed, or are you going to have to spend time developing new partnerships as a part of this grant application? And then do you have other grant funders, other folks who are already committed to funding this program? And those are all different things you can think about as you decide which grants you're more likely to get, and so which grants you should really spend your limited time on. Okay, so you've considered all those factors. You've selected a grant opportunity that seems likely, that you have the time and the resources to pull together. So here are a few tips for developing a strong proposal. So one statistic I heard a long time ago in my grants career, and I'm not sure where it's from or exactly how accurate it is, but pretty much I think it probably is based on my experience, was that 80% of grant applications are not seriously considered because they are not targeted, poorly written, or the guidelines were not followed. And those are actually, it's pretty, if you follow these guidelines, it's pretty easy to get into that 20% of grant applications that are seriously considered. And it mentioned there, many are not considered because they're not targeted. Really, I know some folks think you can just come up with a grant proposal and send it out to a bunch of different funders. And that generic one-size-fits-all is not really the best way to go. Which is not to say that you can't recycle grant language and have that boilerplate information that you use in a lot of different grant proposals, but you just need to make sure you're taking that boilerplate information and targeting your ask to what the goals and objectives of the funder is, that you're making sure that your budget is in line with their giving restrictions and what their allowable expenses are. Maybe, for example, they don't want to fund travel expenses, or maybe they'll only pay for 50% of the total project costs. Making sure you take that into account when you're submitting. That you're following the instructions, and that's pretty easy for all of us, I think, to do if we just look through the instructions that the funder gives us. And I said in there, including format, which really a lot of times you don't have an opportunity to have much choice in formatting anymore with online applications. But in the olden days, when I first started writing grants, they would tell you can only have 1-inch margins, or you have to use 12-point or larger font. And if you didn't, they would throw out your grant proposal. Nowadays, it's more likely that you'll face character or word count limits, and that when you put those into the online application, if you are over, it either won't allow you to submit, or it'll just cut off the rest of what you thought you were saying that's over that count or character limit. Reflecting the funder's language. So, for example, if the funder says, we want to fund services to underserved populations, which I have noted is directly from Oregon Food Bank's Network Support Funds guidelines, if those of you who are partner agencies or regional food banks may be familiar with that opportunity. And so it may be that you don't refer to the population you serve as underserved populations, but if it really is what Oregon Food Bank is referring to as underserved populations, make sure you use that language in your grant proposal, because that makes it easy for Oregon Food Bank as the funder to know that your project fits what we are looking to do. I just looked really quickly on Meyer's website, and for example, in their housing opportunities section, one of their goals is to increase opportunities for Oregonians living on low incomes to build the resources and skills necessary to advance toward their housing goals. So if I was writing a grant for this particular funding opportunity, I would make sure that I referred to the folks that I was going to serve as low income, because that's who the funder says that they want to serve, even if that's not the language that you usually use internally with your to refer to your service recipients. And to make sure that you show and use the language of how you're helping build the resources and the skills for those folks, and use that specific language. Assuming it is that is really what you are doing, and you're not erroneously representing that, but it's a matter of making sure that you word it in the way that the funder will recognize easily that you're doing the same thing that they want to fund. And then being careful of acronyms and jargon. At OFB, see there I used an acronym already. At Oregon Food Bank, we use a ton of acronyms like TFAP and CFS for Community Food Systems. So making sure that the funder, that you explain it, or that you word it in maybe a different way or spell it out, because a lot of the funders that you're going to may not be funders specifically in that particular area or experts in that area. And making sure that the information that you present is consistent across the different parts of your proposal. For example, you may have they always say that your budget should tell the same story as your narrative. So making sure that if you're explaining who it is that is going to implement the program, for example, using job titles, that then in your salaries portion of your budget, that has those same titles in there. Any questions, or Alexis, anything to add?
No, not at this time.
So quickly go through here's the resources that I was mentioning, and you can feel free to, once you get the PowerPoint, click on these links to your heart's content and explore all of the great information that's available online about grants. But these are for grant readiness, either checklists or different information about what you can do to be grant ready. And I looked at all of them as I was kind of compiling my presentation. But these are some more in-depth if you really want to get into it or have a checklist that you can check off or use with other folks in your organization. Where to find funders. So I mentioned the foundation directory online. They have a ton of great information. You can pay a lot of money if you would like the highest level version. I think Oregon Food Bank has kind of a medium version of what information you can pull out and what different types of searches you can do. But this link should take you to the foundation directory online's quick start, and it's free. You just have to sign up for an account, and you can do some basic searches and find different funders. Another great resource is organizations of grant funders, especially regional ones. The one that immediately popped to my mind was the Grant Makers of Oregon and Southwest Washington, and they have lists of their members with links to many of those funders' websites. And then that Oregon and Washington Foundation data books, that's a link to where you can order those books. Grants.gov, which I mentioned was a great clearinghouse for government grants. And then there's a link to learn about grants that the state of Oregon gives. Nonprofit Hub is one of my favorite online resources about all things nonprofit, and I really liked this article, Don't Start Your Nonprofit Grant Writing Until You Read This. So that's, I think, a really helpful article if you're just starting out and want to know, should you even do grant writing? And then there's a link to other grant-related articles that Nonprofit Hub has. The Foundation Center also has what they call Grant Space with lots of resources about grants. In particular, they have a sample document section, and so there's examples of grant proposals, of letters of inquiry, of budgets that you can look at. And then, of course, I should mention that Nonprofit Association of Oregon has lots of resources, and that's oftentimes where I will go to find things or to look for training around grants.
Thank you. Yeah, and if we are a statewide organization, and so there are resources available to everyone throughout the state, and we're a membership organization as well, so there's cost savings associated with membership.
Oh my goodness, thank you both so much for that deep dive into the grant making world. I know that I learned a lot. And I hope that everyone who participated gleaned a lot of valuable information for funding resources. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A. We are so on schedule. It's amazing. So please use this time to ask Darcy and Alexis any questions you might have that are still lingering for you. And to get us started, I have a couple in the queue. But again, the chat box is on your GoToMeeting sidebar, and if you just chat, I will relay those questions to our panelists. So one of the first questions we have here is, you talked about writing a budget, but do you have any tips? And Darcy, I know that one of the resources you just shared had examples, but do you have any, or Alexis, both of you, do you have any tips on writing a budget? To what extent do you, when you're like researching and putting together a budget, are you really looking for specific costs? Do you need to go into that much detail when you're writing a proposal? What ideas do you have?
I'll start off. So I think that was a really good segue about what kind of level of detail. Just thinking about a grant budget that we at Oregon Food Bank submitted that was maybe a little bit too specific. There's really a fine line, I think, between providing enough detail so that your funder gets a really good idea of what are those expenses, how do they relate, how are they going to help you implement your program. And so maybe you don't want to just have supplies because that's pretty general and it doesn't necessarily give a sense of how you're going to use that. And you could always, I sometimes have 3 columns. One is the actual line item that might just say supplies, and then one is the actual amount, and then one says notes, and it gives some examples of what you might do. For example, it might say like feast event supplies as the line item, and you could say may include food or office supplies, or I don't know, Tracy, what other expenses might you need for a feast event?
Often, food. There might be materials like markers and flip chart paper. Certainly, it would be really inclusive to think about paying for childcare or having materials for kids available, translation services, things like that. Those can all add up into costs for a feast event.
Yeah.
And I love the example you just made of asking another coworker to take a look, right? So I think also when I've recently had an experience, you're coming up with a big program budget, and a couple of the people who were working on the program didn't look at the budget, and we had left out a couple of key things that they probably would have caught or thought of. And so making sure that you kind of bring the team in to take a look.
Yeah, good point. And then the way so kind of that with having the notes area and giving some examples, but making it kind of clear that these are examples of what you might do. That gives you a little bit more of a flexibility instead of breaking it out into food for the feast event, office supplies for the feast event, because oftentimes things change, or you're not going to know, or you're not going to really want to spend the time before you submit the grant to know exactly how much it is that you're going to spend on food versus office supplies. So finding that balance between giving the funder enough detail to understand, but not so much detail that it really locks you in to being so restricted when the grant comes in about what you have to spend it on. And then just one other tip, I oftentimes, especially if there's more than just one revenue source, then making sure that you're including both a revenue section and an expense section. And in the revenue section, it gives you the opportunity to show who else is funding or who else you might ask to fund this, and that the funder, because many funders want to know that they're not the only one that is going to contribute to this project. And I always like it if you can not necessarily, if you can not necessarily tell the funder exactly what their funds are going to pay for. If you can say, here's the grant, here's all the expenses that that go into creating this project and program, and we want you to fund $5,000, let's say, of this project, but we're not telling you that your money specifically is going to go to the event supplies and the salaries. But then that gives you more flexibility when you hopefully do get 3 or 4 grants for individual funders to figure out where is the highest need when those funds come in.
Thank you so much. Another question that we have here is, do you have any tips for writing concise or succinct requests?
I think what I usually like to do is I write out the long version. So I'll just kind of throw everything in my grant proposal that I can think of to answer that specific question, or if there's not a specific question, just form the whole grant proposal, and then kind of go back, then leave it for, hopefully you have given yourself enough time to either leave that for a day or so and be able to go back and start cutting. And to me, that helps me make sure that I have everything that I could potentially want to talk about this program, and then give myself some time to reflect and go back to it and see, okay, what is it that is really the most important? Or can I take this sentence and this sentence and combine them? And do they really need that level of detail? Because now that I've written it out, it's supposed to be only 2,000 characters and I have 4,000. And it also, if you have the opportunity to bring others into that process, that sometimes can be helpful depending on how much time you have. But maybe trying to explain or having other folks read it, that will help you determine what is it that is the most important information to boil it down to.
Darcy, one question I have is, would you ever, and maybe it's just grant dependent, would you ever just have like a bulleted list? Like, are there ways to kind of call out or like bring attention to certain aspects of a grant so that it's not just kind of, I don't know, hidden within many paragraphs?
Yeah, definitely. I think if you can use a bulleted list, that's often really helpful because it's easier oftentimes to read. I think you just have to make sure that oftentimes when I'm working on online applications, I'll have everything that I'll be working in a Word document and then copy and paste into the online application. And sometimes it gets a little wonky when you copy and paste bulleted lists. So not to say that you can't use bulleted lists in an online grant proposal, but just kind of pay attention that once you do that pasting, it may look weird, or you may have to do some work around it. And it may be that you never quite know what exactly the funder sees so sometimes they may not, unfortunately, get that list in bulleted format, even though you made that effort. But oftentimes it will be helpful to you to make sure your work is succinct if you're trying to put it in bullet points, and that will translate even if the bullet points don't.
All right, one question here is, for a first-time grant writer, is it better to go small?
Well, I think it's more of one of the first things I guess I would consider is small, maybe in terms of effort and energy, not necessarily the grant amount. How much time is it going to take you away from other things that you need to be doing to submit that grant, or to think about it as the kind of the impact of all that time. Like maybe you are only doing a small grant proposal, but maybe all the work that you're going to do is something that you can then use for other grant opportunities, or for a newsletter article, or an ask to an individual donor. So I think about it more as like how I'm investing the time and what's going to be the payoff of that investment of time.
Excellent. So if you have any more questions, we can take a couple more. I have one last one. So if we don't have any others, this might be the last. And I think, Alexis, this one would be for you. We have a question about 501c6 fundraising, and I think this is coming from someone with a farmer's market. And the question there is, can they fundraise, or how is it different?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Typically, I get these questions from 501c6s or C4s that kind of fall in the social welfare, business league, and advocacy organizations. And the answer is that you can fundraise, but the donations made to you are not tax deductible by the donor. And so just making sure that you're really clear about that and being ethical about that. You still can fundraise, but the donations made to you are not tax deductible.
Cool, thank you. All right, I think that brings us to the end here. I don't see any other questions coming in. Thank you both so much for your time and energy and thought you put into this. I think there's a lot of really great nuggets to pull out of this. And for those of you on the call, this will be recorded, so you can revisit these resources. I will have an email out to everyone with the link to the recording and the slides by the end of the week. And if you have any questions, our emails are here, so feel free to get in touch. And remember the Nonprofit Association of Oregon helpline. That's a great resource available to you. And certainly, if you become members, there are benefits there as well. We thank you so much for participating and joining us today. We will have another webinar in a few months on another topic, and that will be decided by you. So please take the evaluation I will also send out in an upcoming email. Thanks, everyone.